they were about 3 more times to experience doubled up homelessness. And this is often because of the cultural incompetency of policies to consider doubled up homelessness, because a lot of Latinx households tend to double up or move in with family members or friends when they do experience homelessness. And because of this, again, they're not counted in those traditional counts, and they're not able to access those services. And highlighting our CPS students, over 20,000 students are experiencing homelessness, and 90% of these students are, again, doubled up. So they might be staying with family or friends or couch surfing. And these students are eligible for help, but not housing. So they can get all other types of services, but they aren't eligible, and their families are not eligible for housing services. But Bring Chicago Home would change that. It is a different type of funding stream. And if we look at how much our city currently spends on homelessness, Chicago spends about 53 million per year. This is from the 2024 budget, and comparatively, Los Angeles and New York spend a lot more. And if we look at translating that to per capita rates, it still stands that Chicago only spends about 6% of what New York City spends and 8% of what LA spends on addressing homelessness in their cities. So if we look at the per capita rates, we only spend about $20 per person who is unhoused, versus LA and New York City spend a lot much more money to provide preventative services and housing services to these folks. So our solution is a dedicated revenue stream to create more permanent housing and supportive services that would be for our city, and it wouldn't be dependent on grants or funding from the state or federal governments. And so the proposed switch is based on our real estate transfer tax. This tax already exists, and it is the tax that is on the buyer when a property is purchased in Chicago. And so it's a one-time tax when a property is bought, and that is commercial or residential. And currently it is a flat rate, no matter how much the cost of the property is. But what Bring Chicago Home is bringing to voters is, should we adjust our real estate transfer tax so that we can create funding to address housing and supportive services? And so the tax, again, already exists, but we're just proposing to make it fair so that folks who have properties over $1 million will be taxed at a higher rate, and that money will go toward funding these services. So if you look here, the real estate purchase under $1 million would actually see a decrease. So about 93% of home buyers would see a decrease in the real estate transfer tax, down from 0.75 to 0.6%. And properties over $1 million would see an increase. And it's also progressive, so only the amount over $1 million will see an increase. And again, this is only about 7% of home sales, so it won't affect most Chicagoans. And on average, this extra funding would bring in around $100 million to fund permanent housing and supportive services in Chicago. And if we look back a few slides before, that's almost double what we currently spend on housing services through our city budget. So we would almost be doubling the impact of the funding that we have. At this point, we've gotten the question on the ballot. City Council has passed a resolution, and Bring Chicago Home and this real estate transfer tax change is on the ballot, and it's on the primary ballot for March 19th. So if you are early voting or voting on March 10th, you will see it on your ballot, and we are asking Chicago to vote yes. This is really important. The decision is in Chicago voters now to say, yes, we do want this funding to be created to support our unhoused population. And after that, the work will not be done. There will still have to be an introduction and passing of an ordinance through City Council to confirm that the real estate transfer tax will be changed and the funds will go toward these services. But we've seen City Council pass a resolution to include it on the ballot. And if Chicagoans vote yes, that is a good sign that we are going toward getting this ordinance also introduced and passed. This is what the ballot referendum language looks like. So this will be at the end of your March 19th ballot or early voter ballot. And it does have a lot of legal language that describes basically what I said before, that the tax rate will go down for properties under $1 million and will go up for properties over $1 million, and that the funding stream will go toward housing and supportive services. And we want folks to check yes on this ballot referendum. So the important part is, how will the funds be spent? And it's important to note that legally they are earmarked for these services, so they can't be spent on other things. The city will have to spend the bulk of the funding. A lot of it will be used to create and maintain permanent supportive housing and affordable housing in our city. It can also be used for preventative programs and diversion programs to help folks stay out of homelessness. And as far as shelters go, they can be used to create non-congregate models, and there's limited uses for congregate shelters. And to clarify, a congregate shelter would be like a church or an open space where everyone is, maybe staying in bunk beds and it's a shared space, versus non-congregate models, people have their own private space. So it might look like a hotel or apartment. And so these funds can be used to increase staffing and hours of shelters, but they can't be used to create a shelter that is a congregate model. It's really focused on permanent solutions and solutions that keep people housed. And so it's going more toward building affordable housing, developing affordable housing, and maintaining that housing. It will also go toward supportive services for folks. So that could include mental and behavioral health care services, connection to education and employment services, domestic violence resources, and substance use treatment, which we find that when people are housed and have supportive services, they are more likely to stay housed. And through a community-led advisory board, there will be, they will act as the strategic direction for how the funds should be prioritized and spent, and also act as oversight so that we're making sure that those funds are being spent on what the city needs and what we need to prioritize for our unhoused folks. And within that community-led advisory board, there will be people with lived experience and community members that will be in that advocacy space. So the projected number of people housed over 10 years, it's estimated around 7,600 people will be housed, and 15,800 people could receive homelessness prevention assistance. And so this isn't a full solution to the scope of homelessness in our city, but it does really, when it shows that this is a meaningful funding stream and that we want to be able to provide these services for our neighbors and for our communities, that this is important to Chicago voters to fund these services. And it also is a strong bulk and a lot of funding for these services. Again, it's almost double what we currently spend. And so at this time, we just want folks to get out and support Bring Chicago Home. We would love you all to go out and vote yes. Tell your friends and family and your neighbors to go out and vote yes, and say, we want this funding stream. It may not affect you if you're not buying property, but it may help you or someone in the future when experiencing housing instability. So these QR codes have some volunteer opportunities, and you can also check out the website for canvassing and phone banking opportunities to really just spread the word about Bring Chicago Home. A lot of people don't know about it, didn't know it was going to be on the ballot, but are very receptive when you talk to them. I've canvassed and talked to folks about it these last few months, and generally people are very receptive, and they think it sounds like a great idea for our city to increase the tax on really expensive property over $1 million so that we can better support our folks that are experiencing housing instability. And there's also a QR code to donate, and those funds would go toward people that are doing the work on the ground and materials so that we can continue to spread the word. I went through everything a little quickly, but I want to, yes, give times for questions. And if I need to go back to any slides, I can also do that.
Great, great. That's great. Thank you for that presentation. So for anybody that's just joining, could you just in like the simplest form, and I know that that may be difficult. This is a kind of complicated topic.
Yeah.
Could you just like break down what is Bring Chicago?
Mm.
Bring Chicago home. Why is this on the ballot?
Yes. Thank you. I'm going to leave this slide up because it gives you a little bit of overview of what Bring Chicago Home is, but really Bring Chicago Home was built out of grassroots efforts to address homelessness in our city. It's been a campaign for like the last 5 years or so, and a lot of folks are people with lived experience. I'm someone with lived experience speaking on behalf of the campaign to say that our communities need more funding, and we need more funding for affordable housing and supportive services to keep folks housed. And so Bring Chicago Home is really a solution to that issue, and a solution that is permanent and funding that goes straight to creating and maintaining these services. And so again, what Bring Chicago Home proposes is we change the real estate transfer tax, which is again a one-time tax on the buyer when purchasing a property in Chicago. This goes for residential and real estate properties. And the properties purchased that are under $1 million. So if you're planning to buy property under $1 million, this would actually decrease for you and you would pay less. And properties over $1 million would see an increase in this tax. And the funding from that increase in the tax would go toward those permanent supportive housing, keeping people housed, preventative services, and funding to address homelessness in our city.
And when you say the funds will go towards permanent housing, what exactly does that include? Like what does that look like for residents?
Sure. So a lot of what we think about with public housing and housing services is federally funded. And so this money would be city funded and could go toward building affordable housing units and maintaining or updating current affordable housing spaces. So the money will be funneled through the city, but will go out toward developers and nonprofits and people who do the work already and are already in it. So there's a lot of organizations, including Thresholds, who do work around permanent supportive housing and affordable housing and creating those social services for folks to be connected to. And to go more into what a permanent supportive housing model is, if folks don't know, is for people who need more support. It is a housing space. It's usually like a studio or apartment, and they have connections to services in-house. So that would look like case management. They might have access to mental and behavioral health care either on site or they get connected, through the housing services. And it's really about wrap around and understanding that it's usually not just housing. Folks need food, they need employment, and they need stability in order to stay housed. And it's up to the person to stay in that housing space, or some people move on after and are able to then like afford market rate or stay in that permanent supportive housing model, just depending on their need at the time. Does that help?
That makes sense. So it sounds like instead of like kind of reinventing the wheel, it's the funding will be used to kind of like support and enhance those organizations who are already like doing that work.
Yeah. We have a lot of information and data to say that housing models with supportive services and getting people housed quickly does increase their chances of staying housed and staying connected to those services. And so really it's about funding it more. It's not about changing the way that we do things. It's about putting more funding toward these services because we know the need is very high. And the current funding does not allow for enough services and housing units currently. The CHA housing waitlist can be anywhere from 6 months to 25 years, which isn't necessarily helpful if you're unhoused. And so thinking about how we can create other streams of funding to better support folks who are being lost in these gaps because there isn't enough resources at this time.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Now, this leads me to the next question. And that is, who is impacted by the problem of homelessness in Chicago, and who will be helped? This is an interesting question to me because I know we spoke earlier and like kind of discussed like it's different degrees of homelessness, if you will. If you're some people might not consider themselves homeless even though they may be sleeping on someone's couch. So it kind of made me look at things in a different perspective. So could you kind of touch on that? Like who exactly is impacted by the problem of homelessness in Chicago?
Yeah, I think that homelessness can look very different and routes to homelessness is so individualized. In my experience, the routes that I've become unhoused have been different. It's been maybe a safety issue, a health issue with my apartment, or issues with a landlord. And so it really can be like it's not something you always see. We do see street homelessness pretty often, and that again is something that will still continue to fund those services for people that are living on the streets and people that are accessing shelters. But the important part about this funding is that it includes folks that are doubled up, and the issues that they experience is that they're not counted in normal definitions of homelessness for federal funding. And so they can't access those services. So for example, I worked at a shelter previously, and if a student came in who was, him and his mom were homeless and they were staying with a mom's friend, that's not a stable source of housing. And it's also, when you're doubled up, you might be again sleeping on a couch, on an air mattress. I've slept on a floor, whatever you can get. So and being in those spaces, it can also cause it's harder to stay employed. It's harder to keep your mental health care in check and get all the resources you need because you might be thinking about where am I going to stay next week, right? If your mind is so focused on where am I going to be living, where am I going to be staying, you're not necessarily going to be able to focus on all the other facets of your life and keep everything in check. And so making sure that we are counting people who are doubled up and people who are, couch surfing, which tends to be young people. It tends to be people of color. Black folks and Latina folks tend to do this more often because of usually like cultural things. And the ways that where and when they have access to services. And so when we see how our services are distributed in equally across our city, this is a way to fund for our entire city and prioritize communities that experience homelessness at higher rates, like our Black community and our Hispanic communities and our young people and older folks as well. So I think the scope of the issue, when we look at 68,000, that is a big number. And 65% of those folks can't access normal housing services currently because they are doubled up. And so I thank you, Amani, for bringing that up and bringing that forward because it is something that I didn't even know that was considered homelessness until, after I had done it a few times and was like, this has been terrible. But it really is an important piece to make sure that we're capturing everyone and not letting people fall through those gaps because they might be stable for a week, they might be stable for a month, but you never know when things could, they might end up on the street or the shelter. And we want to get people before that point, so that they can stay housed and stay connected to services and stay employed.
Great answer. That leads me to my next question. Now I know you spoke on if the property is under $1 million, taxes won't increase; they'll actually decrease. But what? So I know that applies to property owners. Now, is there a chance that a person who's renting, that their rent can increase by the implementation of the increase in taxes for those who have properties greater than $1 million?
Yeah, that's a great question and a super valid concern. The prices of rent are not expected to increase because this type of tax does not change the operational costs of a building. And so because it's a one-time tax when a property is bought, from month to month, that won't change how much like maintenance or upkeep that space might need. And so there isn't really a reason to raise rents for this. And we've seen in other areas where they've done more affordable housing development, like LA and San Francisco, and done these types of programs, that it doesn't really affect development. And it like the rent increases wouldn't be because of this, because it wouldn't change the operational costs of month to month billing. Did that answer your
So
question?
that makes sense. So if the rent is being increased, it wouldn't be able the landlord wouldn't be able to attribute it to the actual increase of these property taxes, because it's
Yeah,
not
well, it
changing.
isn't yeah, to clarify, it's not a property tax, so it's not a tax. It's a tax when real estate is transferred owners. So it's again one time, and so it wouldn't rent is month to month, and so that because it wouldn't change the operational costs. And I do want to note as well that affordable housing is waived from this. So if affordable housing spaces are being bought and sold, they would not be affected by this tax.
Great, great. Um, and how and a majority of our audience are Austinites, or they live on the west side.
Mhm.
How would this impact economic development, specifically on the west side of Chicago?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, bringing development into a space, and bringing affordable housing, it um, it's important in a community that needs it, especially. And for this type of funding, it is city funded and it is for our city. And part of the process of understanding where to prioritize these funds is to consider communities that have less access to resources and may have been historically divested in. And so when we think about this community advisory board and working with communities to see how this funding should be spent, that's a really important piece to the campaign, is to say who are we not capturing. There's an overrepresentation of folks on the west and south sides that experience homelessness, and Black Chicagoans that experience homelessness. And so prioritizing those communities and people that need these services is one part of it. And two, bringing development and resources into communities. And again, I can't say that they're going to target X neighborhood. I don't know where the funding will go. That's part of that community advisory board and the time it takes to plan, implement the planning. But I think it's a good opportunity for folks to say, hey, we want this, and to continue that conversation and see how that could be beneficial to the Austin community in the future, or what that could look like in your community.
Hmm. And I heard you mention the community advisory board. Are there or will there be any opportunities for community residents or stakeholders to try to join or be a part of that
I
advisory?
Yeah, I believe it's an elected board.
Mhm.
There's a slide on. I don't have a ton of information on this community advisory board because it technically doesn't exist yet. And so if this ordinance is passed, it will take about 2 years before it's implemented. And that's one, to start accruing funds, and two, so that planning process can be implemented. But the community-led advisory board will be chosen by community, and it will be made up of community stakeholders, people with lived experience, and advocates around the city, and people who do the work. And so I think it is a good opportunity for people to look out for and get involved in. Slash, I think it's a good way to say we want this community advisory board to still be within our community, and we want to hold them accountable to the work that we're doing and what that could look like. So I think there's still some planning and like vetting out that needs to happen for that community advisory board. But I think it's helpful to hear from communities now what they expect and what they would want that to look like, and what they want their relationship with that advisory board to look like.
Definitely, definitely, I agree. I just wanted to make sure I put that on folks' radar,
Mm-hmm.
just moving forward, just to be on the lookout for that. Then I think that leads me to my next question. I think this might be the last question. Then we'll go ahead and wrap up. And I know it's an important one that everyone's wants to know. How does all of this relate to the migrant situation that's currently going on in Chicago?
Yeah. So I think part of that answer is this campaign started long before the migrant crisis. It's been around for many years, and it's really focused on those like permanent long-term solutions. And so with our migrant crisis, a lot of the federal and state funding is very reactive and kind of band-aid solutions that this funding isn't really, you know, um, going toward. It's going toward, but again, anyone who's homeless in our city could benefit from these funds in the future. And so it's not to say that, migrants wouldn't be able to access these spaces. It's to say these are permanent solutions, and, funding more long-term things that help people stay housed, not necessarily what the funding that migrants are receiving are, which is a lot of kind of reactive shelter and that type of care. So, it the issues are, I don't think that they should be separated, right? Because we're still talking about unhoused folks, but the ways in which we're addressing them, the migrant crisis is very much being addressed at like a federal and state level, and this is really funding for our city, and funding through our city. And so I think that's an important point to make, is, that um, these solutions are focused on, a different type of response than a lot of the funding that is going toward migrants, and that it's, from our city for our city. So.
So by this being like city based, and then the funding, you said it's coming from for the migrants are coming from like this kind of a state and federal level. Does the rapid relief funding and different shelters, does that impact the work that you're doing with this in any type of way?
Not necessarily. I think because a lot of the rapid relief isn't the type of relief that this would fund. It's like a separate style of response. Um, And again, we know that our homelessness problem was here before the migrant situation, and there's still folks in Chicago that need to be housed, and we need solutions like affordable housing development and permanent supportive housing spaces for our city, whether or not we have a migrant crisis happening. And so, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Great. And yeah, I think that was the last question. Serena, if you want to close out, or if you have any other announcements that you would like to make, like about election day and the bill, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say again, early voting has started. So if you are going to vote, this is a great opportunity to say, yes, I want to support folks that are unhoused and experiencing housing instability in my community, in my city, and I want this money to go toward these services. If you're interested in getting connected to the campaign, there's plenty of upcoming opportunities to canvas and phone bank if you want a virtual option. And I'm sure, Amani, you can share my contact if anyone has any follow-up questions, wants any materials, or to get connected to the campaign. Very much feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to, yeah, connect.
Yes, yes. If you want to get connected, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will be more than happy to connect you with Serena. And please remember, if you want to be connected to the hub, in need of any services, please reach out. And last but not least, safe and peaceful applications. The deadline is March the 6th. So please, please, if you haven't came into the office and got your app done, please reach out to me again. Stay tuned for our next Hub One-on-One, March 26th, with your passion first. Until next time.